I've developed this conflict of interest analysis chart to help students go through the process of identifying a conflict of interest. So the first thing we're going to look at is any transaction that has economic benefit to the charity or the other party. So primarily those transactions fall into two categories. One is a charity conducting business with another party, an outside organization, whether it's an individual or a company. And the other transaction that's pretty common in this situation would be the charity hiring someone. That's a transaction involving an economic benefit, right? Because the person who's being hired is getting a paycheck. If there is no transaction involving economic benefit, then we really don't need to look at the conflict of interest. If there is a transaction, then we need to dig a little further, go a little further into our analysis. Is a related party involved? So the transaction has two parties. The charity is one party, and the second party could be an individual, or it could be a company or a business. Now, how do we know if there's a related party? Well, we have to look at the other party and see if there's a disqualified person involved. What's a disqualified person? A disqualified person is anyone who is in the position to substantially influence the decision making of the organization, and a family member of anyone who's in a position to substantially influence the decision making of the organization. Those are individuals who are disqualified persons. But a related party also includes entities that aren't individuals, like a business. Now, if a disqualified person has a large ownership interest in a company, and that company is involved in the transaction, that company is a related party. Again, if a board member owns a business, the business is doing transacting business with the charity, then that business is a related party. And therefore, if that's the case, and this happens all the time, by the way, but if those things are present, then there's a potential for self-dealing. This chart says, therefore, there's self-dealing, but there's a potential for self-dealing. So when there's a transaction involving a related party, because there's a potential for self-dealing, we have to apply the charity's conflict of interest policy at this point. Now, it might be that the board has gone through an analysis of this transaction and found that the charity is really gaining the economic advantage. In that case, the conflict of interest, while it's apparent, is not prohibited because the charity is getting the economic benefit. But is there an excess benefit to a disqualified person? If no, then at least we've applied the conflict of interest policy, and if there's not an excess benefit, then it will pass muster with the Attorney General or whoever looks into it. If there is an excess benefit, then we have to stop and consider the consequences. Will the excess benefit, if you're caught, simply be a tax on the excess, or will it be considered private annulment? Let me just use a real life situation. Conflict of interest. I worked for Community Servings. It is a nonprofit organization that provides meals to people who are homebound because they're ill. Great mission, great organization too. One of the board members owns a business that's a food distributor. And Community Servings, the charity, did business with the board member's business, the food distribution. Is there a transaction? You bet. The business between the charity purchasing the food from the business. Is there a related party involved? Yes, a board member owned a substantial portion of this business. And so the board member had an economic interest in this entire transaction. So there is potential for self-dealing. Now we apply the charity's conflict of interest policy, which in this case said the board had to go through a bidding process, and it did. And the board member's company came in well below anyone else. So really, the charity, Community Servings, is getting the benefit of the transaction because the food that they're purchasing from this business, they're getting at a huge discount, more than anybody else would, and more than a better discount than they would get anywhere else. So there is no excess benefit to a disqualified person in that case. So we will let that conflict of interest situation stand. We are well documented in case anyone complains. So there's not a problem there. There's a conflict of interest, but it doesn't pose a problem. If, in fact, there was no bidding process, so the charity didn't know if it could get a better discount somewhere else, then there might be an excess benefit to a disqualified person. The charity might feel that it needs to do business with that board member's business because the board member can sway the rest of the board in that direction. So then we'd have to consider the consequences. But in the scenario I just presented to you, there was no excess benefit. And the charity went through a bidding process, and also the board member disqualified herself from the final vote of the bidding process. So, so that's an example of a conflict interest analysis, and why the conflict of interest can stand, why it's not prohibited, and why there aren't dire consequences to the organization.